My name is Amanda Lee. I am 34 years old, a senior data analyst at one of the largest analytics firms in Chicago. And until that morning, I thought I had a stable career. It was my 7th work anniversary, the kind of milestone that usually comes with cake, awkward speeches, and a few polite pats on the back. I walked into the conference room expecting all of that, not realizing I was about to be handed the most humiliating gift of my life. The first thing I saw was the banner stretched across the wall in glittery gold letters. It read, "Happy Work Anniversary, Amanda," though my last name was misspelled in bold print. In the center of the table sat a cake with sloppy blue frosting and 5 uneven candles, as if no one had bothered to check that it was actually 7 years, not 5. 20 of my colleagues lined the edges of the room, each holding a paper cup of coffee, their eyes fixed anywhere but on me. I smiled out of habit, clutching the folder I had brought from my desk, and stepped inside. At the far end of the table, my boss, Victoria Price, stood with her perfectly manicured nails resting on a single sheet of paper. She had been my manager for most of my time here, a woman with a smile as sharp as broken glass. She greeted me with a warmth that felt staged and gestured toward the empty chair across from her. I sat down still, trying to read the room, wondering why no one seemed ready to start the celebration. Without a pause, Victoria slid the paper toward me. It was a blank resignation form. Her voice was smooth, almost cheerful, as she told me the best anniversary gift I could give the company was my resignation effective immediately. For a moment, I didn't understand the words. My brain clung to the idea that this was a joke, some twisted icebreaker before the real party began. Then I saw the way her smile never reached her eyes, and the way the others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. 7 years of early mornings and late nights of canceled vacations and projects delivered under impossible deadlines, and this was my send-off. The banner above the door felt like a cruel punchline. The untouched cake seemed to mock me from its place in the middle of the table. I forced my lips into a thin smile, not trusting my voice just yet, afraid it might break, or worse, explode into anger. I glanced around the room, hoping someone might speak up, but every gaze dropped the moment I looked their way. My hands rested on my lap, gripping the edge of my skirt to keep them from trembling. I asked the only question that seemed possible: why? Her explanation was rehearsed, something about my performance not meeting expectations, and yet I knew it was a lie. My work had been flawless. I had saved contracts, brought in clients, and solved problems that no one else could touch. I wanted to argue to lay out every fact that proved her wrong, but I knew the trap she was setting. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a public execution in a glass-walled room. Any protest would only make me look desperate, and desperation was what she wanted. So I kept my expression calm and let her think she had won. As I reached for the pen she had placed beside the paper, I felt the heat of every eye on me. My fingers curled around it, steady now, not from acceptance, but from something colder and far more controlled. I wrote my name in neat, deliberate strokes, slid the paper back to her, and met her gaze without flinching. She smiled again, satisfied, and began talking about the logistics of my exit. I barely heard her. Because in that moment, a thought took root in my mind, clear and sharp. This wasn't the end of my career. This was the beginning of her unraveling. And she had just handed me the opening I needed. But what she didn't know was that I already had something that could end her career without me lifting my voice. 7 years ago, I walked into Mason Analytics clutching a thin resume and a lot of hope. I had been juggling 2 jobs just to keep up with student loans, so getting hired here felt like a break I couldn't waste. Victoria Price was the one who interviewed me, and she seemed sharp but fair, the kind of leader who could shape my raw skills into something valuable. In those first months, she took me under her wing. She'd invite me to sit in on meetings I wasn't required to attend, explain the company's inner workings, and offer advice on navigating office politics. I soaked it all in, grateful for the attention. When she presented my ideas as her own in those early days, I told myself it was just part of the learning curve. That's how the game worked, I thought. You pay your dues, prove yourself, and your turn will come. I threw myself into the job with more energy than I thought I had. I was always the first one in and the last one out. I remembered everyone's birthdays and made cupcakes for the break room. On Friday mornings, I'd bring in donuts just to make the team smile before diving into the week's numbers. It wasn't in my job description, but it made the long hours feel worth it. For a while, it seemed to be working. Victoria praised me in private, told me I was one of her best hires. I believed her. I believed that loyalty and hard work would pay off in the end. But slowly, small changes began to creep in. Invitations to certain meetings stopped appearing in my calendar. Emails I sent would sit unanswered for days, even on urgent matters. When I spoke up in meetings, my suggestions were met with silence, only to be repeated by someone else minutes later and greeted with applause. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but the pattern became impossible to ignore. The mentor who had once championed me was now turning into someone else entirely, and I couldn't understand why. The Knox Industries project was the kind of opportunity people build entire careers on. It was a massive account one that could put our firm on the national map if we landed it. I was assigned to lead the analytics side, and I poured every ounce of my energy into it. For weeks, I stayed late at the office building a custom dashboard that could give Knox real-time visibility into their supply chain, something no competitor was offering. It was elegant, precise, and powerful. I was proud of it in a way I hadn't been proud of anything in years. The night before the presentation, I emailed the final deck to Victoria, copying the rest of the team. Her reply was brief but glowing, saying my work was outstanding, and that this could be the one that changed everything. I went home that night feeling a rare kind of satisfaction, convinced that my hard work was about to pay off. When I walked into the conference room the next morning, the projector was already on. Victoria stood at the front, flipping through slides I didn't recognize. My heart sank. The layout was similar, but my name was gone. The dashboard was there, my design exactly, but the credit line now read Leadership Team. I asked her what had happened to my materials. She barely looked up and said she had made a few adjustments, nothing major. I sat through that presentation like a ghost in my own work. Every question Knox asked, she answered, using insights I had spent weeks perfecting. Every compliment landed at her feet. By the end of the meeting, Knox had signed on. It was the biggest win the company had ever seen. A week later, Victoria was promoted to vice president. I was handed a $25 coffee gift card with a Post-it note that said thanks. It should have been my warning the moment I realized the rules were different for people like her. But instead, I told myself to work harder to prove my worth beyond doubt. I didn't know it yet, but I had just witnessed the first act in a pattern that would nearly cost me everything. Tekara was the kind of client that made executives lose sleep. They were a rising force in the industry, fast ambitious, and looking for a complete analytics overhaul on a brutal timeline. When the CEO himself assigned the project to our department, Victoria announced in the team meeting that I would be taking point. She even said my experience with Knox made me perfect for the job. For a moment, I believed her. Recognition had been rare, and I thought maybe this was my chance to prove myself without interference. From that day on, my life revolved around Tekara. I canceled a long-planned vacation without a second thought. Weekends disappeared into late nights at my desk, fueled by coffee and the quiet hum of the office after everyone else had gone home. I built a predictive model that could save Tekara millions in preventable losses, using a level of precision and adaptability I had never achieved before. It was more than work, it was my best work. 3 days before the presentation, Victoria called me into her office. She didn't offer me a seat. She just said there had been a change of plans. Her nephew Ethan would be delivering the presentation instead. I stared at her, sure I had misheard. Ethan had been at the company for barely 2 months. He had no background in analytics, no role in the project, and no idea how the model even functioned. She said Tekara's executives were traditional, that they responded better to male presenters. The words landed like a punch to the chest. This was my project, my months of work, and now it was being handed to someone who didn't even know the language of the data. I argued, explaining that Ethan wouldn't be able to answer technical questions. She brushed it off, saying she would be listed as co-creator and could step in if needed. It wasn't personal, she said, just business, but it felt personal in every possible way. I left her office with my jaw clenched so tight it ached. There was no point in fighting at that moment. She had made her decision, and any resistance would be twisted into insubordination. But I wasn't about to let my work disappear without a trace. That night, I copied every file, every email, every draft of the model. I documented the evolution from the first concept to the final product, noting each late-night breakthrough and the solutions to every obstacle. It wasn't revenge, not yet. It was insurance. If she wanted to pretend I hadn't been the driving force behind Tekara's solution, I would at least hold on to the truth. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I already knew I might need it. And when the day came, I wanted to be ready. 2 weeks after the Tekara presentation, Victoria called me into a meeting I hadn't seen on my calendar. The HR rep wasn't there. It was just her, a printed document, and a pen. She slid the paper across the table, saying it was a formal warning for poor performance. The accusations were vague: lack of initiative communication issues, failure to meet expectations. None of it was backed by specifics. I asked for examples, but she cut me off, telling me to sign. I did, because refusing would only make things worse. From that day forward, the target on my back grew larger. Deadlines landed on my desk that no one could realistically meet. Meetings were rescheduled without notice, and then I'd be reprimanded for missing them. Projects I had started were reassigned midstream with no explanation. Every misstep, real or manufactured, was carefully documented in my personnel file. It was a slow, deliberate squeeze designed to make me look like I couldn't keep up. But if Victoria thought I was just absorbing the hits, she was wrong. I kept my head down, yes, but I recorded everything. Every contradictory instruction, every email that proved I'd been left out of the loop, every version of a project I had worked on before it was taken away. It became a habit, almost a ritual, to save the evidence before it could be erased. I didn't know it yet, but I had already collected the weapon that would save me. The morning after I was forced to resign, I called HR and asked for an exit interview. Marla, the HR director, sounded surprised when I made one more request to meet with our CEO, Elliot Mason, before I left. She hesitated, saying it wasn't standard procedure, but promised to see what she could do. Less than an hour later, she called back to say the meeting was approved. 15 minutes with a man I had only seen in passing over the years. It was unusual enough to stir curiosity, and that was exactly the point. I spent the rest of the day at my kitchen table, surrounded by files. Not a single page was marked confidential in the way that mattered legally, but every page told a story. I organized 5 years of work into a polished transition report, over 100 pages, detailing every project I had touched. Each one included scope challenges, outcomes, and clear attribution for every contributor. Even Victoria's name appeared when it was deserved. It wasn't a revenge document. There were no accusations, no bitter commentary. Instead, it read like the careful notes of someone who wanted to leave their position responsibly, but woven into the clean formatting and bullet points was an undeniable truth patterns of leadership that didn't match the official narratives. Anyone reading it closely would see the discrepancies for themselves. By midnight, I had triple-checked the report and emailed a digital copy to Elliot's assistant with a note saying I would bring a printed version to our meeting. The work was done. Now all that was left was to wait. And as I sat in the quiet of my apartment, I realized this wasn't just about leaving a job. It was the opening move in a game I intended to win. The real play would begin in Elliot Mason's office. Elliot Mason's office was everything I expected from a man who had built the company from the ground up, spacious, sharp lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the Chicago skyline. He stood when I entered, greeting me with a firm handshake before gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. His tone was polite but curious, as he mentioned he'd heard my resignation was unexpected. Then he asked the question I knew was coming. Why was I leaving? I placed the leather-bound transition report on his desk before answering. I told him I believed in leaving things better than I found them, and this document covered every project I'd worked on in my time at the company. He flipped through the pages, eyebrows lifting slightly at the level of detail. When he asked again about my decision to leave, I simply said it felt like the right time for a change. No accusations, no bitterness, just a quiet confidence that made him look at me a little longer. Then he shifted the conversation to the Takara project. His questions were direct, specific about the predictive model's architecture, its data sources, and the variables used in the simulations. I answered each one without hesitation, giving the kind of explanations only the person who built it could give. His expression didn't change much, but I caught the subtle pause as he closed the report and leaned back in his chair. The 15-minute slot stretched well past half an hour. When I finally left, I knew I hadn't accused Victoria of anything, but I had given Elliot something far more powerful, a reason to start asking his own questions. And if he did, the answers would lead him exactly where I wanted them to. 2 days after my meeting with Elliot, I was taping up the last box in my apartment when my phone rang. The number wasn't saved, but I recognized his voice instantly. He asked if I could come to the office the next morning at 9 sharp. No explanation, just a polite request that left me lying awake most of the night, turning over every possible reason in my mind. When I arrived, the security guard at the front desk greeted me with an almost knowing smile. Elliot's assistant met me at the elevator and led me straight to the top floor. Inside his office, Gwen Torres, the CFO, was waiting. Her expression was professional, but her eyes hinted at something more. She explained they had gone through my transition report line by line, comparing it against financial records, staffing allocations, and official project credits. What they found, she said, was disturbing. The Knox and Takara projects were at the top of the list. On paper, both had been managed by Victoria with teams of up to 8 people, but the actual work had been done by far fewer, often just me and 1 or 2 junior analysts. My contributions had been stripped from the official narrative, while Victoria claimed credit and misdirected resources. Gwen didn't linger on the details. She simply said the board had voted to terminate Victoria effective immediately. Elliot slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a revised organizational chart with my name printed in bold, Director of Analytics. He said they wanted me to take the position permanently to lead the department I had quietly kept afloat for years. For a moment, I just stared at the page. I hadn't asked for this, but it was exactly the kind of role I had once dreamed about before all the politics and betrayal. I told him I would accept only if 3 conditions were met. First, a complete departmental review with no repercussions for honest feedback. Second, the implementation of a transparent project attribution system, so every contribution from intern to director was properly documented. Third, Ethan would remain on the team. He had followed his aunt's orders, but I believed he deserved the chance to learn a better way. Elliot listened without interrupting, then glanced at Gwen. Both nodded. All 3 conditions were reasonable and would be honored. He pushed the contract toward me, and I signed it with a steady hand. There was no rush of vindictive triumph, just a deep sense of satisfaction that the truth had done the work for me. Walking back into the department that afternoon, I felt every pair of eyes follow me. Some looked relieved, others wary, all of them curious about what would come next. I knew trust wouldn't be rebuilt in a single day, but this was the start. The damage Victoria had left behind was real, but so was the opportunity to create something better. This wasn't about replacing her. It was about restoring balance, about proving that integrity could survive in a place that had rewarded the opposite for too long. And as I settled into my new office, I realized the most satisfying part of this moment wasn't that I had won. It was that I had won without ever playing her game. Taking over the department felt less like stepping into a promotion and more like stepping into a rebuild. The first thing I did was implement the project attribution system I had promised. Every contribution logged, every name recorded where it belonged. Within weeks, the tension that had hung over the team for years began to lift. People spoke up in meetings, ideas flowed more freely, and the petty undercurrents of competition faded. By the end of the first quarter, our department posted the highest performance numbers in company history. Ethan surprised me the most. Freed from his aunt's shadow, he threw himself into the work with an eagerness I hadn't expected. He asked questions, stayed late when needed, and delivered results that made me glad I had insisted on keeping him. Watching him grow into a capable analyst was a reminder that leadership isn't just about holding people accountable. It's about giving them room to rise. As for Victoria, she found a position at another firm across town. I heard she still tells a version of the story where she's the one who was wronged. Let her. People will believe what they want to believe, but the records, the timelines, and the outcomes speak louder than gossip ever could. The most devastating weapon against a liar isn't anger, it's true. That truth had not only cleared my name, but reshaped the way my team worked. If there's one thing I'd tell anyone who's been underestimated or treated unfairly, it's this: keep records, stay professional, and let the evidence speak for itself. Sooner or later, the right eyes will see it, and when they do, you won't need to raise your voice to be heard.